The land deed was soaking wet with her father's blood when Eliza Bancroft pressed it against her chest and told the judge it was hers, and she dared any man in Caldwell, Kansas, to say otherwise. That was the spring of 1874, and the town of Caldwell had seen its fair share of stubborn folk ride through its dusty Main Street, but nobody, not the old-timers nursing their whiskey at the Silver Spur Saloon, not the land agent who'd been stealing parcels of territory from widows and orphans since before the war, not even the circuit judge who blew through every 3 months smelling of cigars and river water, had ever seen a woman stand at the center of a crowded courthouse with her boots planted wide and her jaw set like iron and refuse, absolutely refuse, to sit down until she was heard. Eliza Bancroft was 26 years old that spring. She had her mother's dark auburn hair and her father's gray eyes, which people in town said were the color of a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to storm. She stood 5 feet 4 inches in her worn leather boots, but she carried herself in a way that made men instinctively take a half step backward when she entered a room. She had managed her father Thomas Bancroft's cattle ranch for 2 full years before his death, keeping the books, negotiating with buyers in Wichita, handling the hands who sometimes thought a woman's instruction was optional, and she had done it well enough that the ranch was pulling profit when most outfits around them were sinking. Then Thomas Bancroft died on a cold February morning, thrown from a horse he'd ridden 100 times before, and by the time the ground thawed enough to bury him properly, a man named Harlan Greer had filed a competing claim on the Bancroft land. Harlan Greer was the kind of man that the West produced in plentiful supply during those years, a man who wore wealth like a coat he'd borrowed without asking, who smiled wide and shook hands firmly, and whose eyes were always calculating something behind the warmth he projected. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, sat on the town council, and had the ear of men who mattered in Topeka. He was 51 years old, thickly built, with silver hair combed back from a broad forehead and hands that had not seen hard work in at least a decade. He had 2 sons who were old enough to be Eliza's older brothers and a wife who had died in childbirth years before and whom he never mentioned. His claim was filed on the basis of a promissory note, a document, he said, that Thomas Bancroft had signed before his death, pledging 640 acres of the Bancroft homestead as security against a business loan of $3,000. The note was real enough. Eliza did not dispute that part. What she disputed was the interpretation. Her father had pledged the land as security, not as payment. The loan had not been called in. Her father had been making payments. She had the receipts. She had the ledger, she had everything. The debt was not in default. Harlan Greer had simply waited for Thomas Bancroft to die and then decided that a woman alone was easier to push off the land than a man would have been. He was not entirely wrong in that calculation. Not in Caldwell, Kansas, in 1874, where the law bent toward men who had money and standing, and where a woman's right to hold property was a matter that made most judges deeply uncomfortable. There was no shortage of people in town who felt sorry for Eliza in the way that people feel sorry for a lost cause sympathetically, from a safe distance, unwilling to actually do anything about it. The circuit judge, a portly man named Abernathy who wore his coat too tight and his opinions too loose, had already scheduled the hearing for the first week of April. The understanding in town, spoken quietly but widely, was that Abernathy was likely to side with Greer. Not because the law necessarily required it, but because Greer had hosted Abernathy at a very fine supper the previous autumn, and because judges in circuit courts often found it practical to align themselves with the most powerful man in a county rather than with the most righteous one. Eliza knew all of this. She had not been sleeping well. She had been spending her evenings at the kitchen table in the ranch house, which was a solid, square building that her father had built with his own hands in 1859, going through every piece of paper she owned by lamplight, building her case with the careful patience of a woman who understood that she had to be twice as right as any man would need to be in order to have half the chance. She needed a lawyer. The problem was that lawyers in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1874, were not exactly a thriving industry. There was old Prescott, who handled wills and property transfers, and who had already excused himself from the Bancroft matter on the grounds that he had worked with Greer in the past, and could not in good conscience represent either party, which Eliza translated as, he did not want to make an enemy of Harlan Greer. There was a young man named Tully who had read law in Missouri and set up a shingle in town the previous year, but he had taken one look at the case and the parties involved and found a pressing prior engagement that would apparently last indefinitely. It was the owner of the general store, a kind-hearted woman named Margaret Hughes, who first mentioned the name Robert Sullivan to Eliza. "He came through last fall," Margaret said, measuring out flour behind her counter while Eliza stood with her list, half paying attention. "Stayed at the boarding house for about 3 weeks. He is a lawyer, a real one, went to school for it back east, practiced in St. Louis for some years. He is out here now riding circuit on his own, taking cases where he finds them." "Is he good?" Eliza asked. "I don't know if he is good," Margaret said honestly. "He won a case for Jeremiah Ford over the disputed water rights on his property, and Jeremiah told me the other party had a much stronger position on paper, so there is that. Where is he now? Last I heard, he was working a case down in Medicine Lodge, but he comes back through this way. Word is he might be passing through Caldwell again sometime in March." "March is only 3 weeks before the hearing," Eliza said. Margaret wrapped her flour in brown paper and looked at Eliza with the direct, clear gaze of a woman who had also spent many years navigating a world that was not built for her convenience. "Then you had better get a letter to him before that." Eliza wrote the letter that same evening. She was not a woman given to embellishment or excessive sentiment in her professional correspondence. She stated the facts clearly: the land, the deed, the promissory note, Greer's claim, the hearing date, the amount at stake. She stated her position. She said she could pay, not generously but fairly, and that she had documentation to support every claim she intended to make. She sealed the letter, paid the additional rate for express delivery at the post office the following morning, and then went back to her ranch and her ledgers and waited. The reply came 11 days later, which, given the state of mail delivery in central Kansas in early March, was practically miraculous. It was short, written in a hand that was precise and slightly slanted, the handwriting of a man who had been trained to write formally but who moved quickly when he had something to say. "Miss Bancroft, I have reviewed your summary of the matter. I believe your position is defensible and likely correct on the merits. I will arrive in Caldwell no later than March 20th. Please have all relevant documentation prepared. R. Sullivan, attorney at law." She read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer with her land deed. Robert Sullivan arrived in Caldwell on March 19th, a day earlier than promised, which was either a good sign or the kind of small efficiency that meant very little. Eliza was not at the train station to meet him, because she had not known he would be early, and she was out on the east pasture with her foreman, a quiet and capable man named Pete Dawes, going over the spring branding schedule. She came in at dusk with mud on her boots and horse smell on her coat to find a man sitting on the front porch of the ranch house in the gathering cold, his hat on his knee and a leather satchel beside his chair. She stopped at the gate and looked at him. He was younger than she had expected. She had built up an image in her mind, the word attorney combined with St. Louis, combined with whatever vague, anxious hope. She had attached to that reply letter had produced a mental portrait of a man somewhere in his 40s, solid and authoritative, carrying the visible weight of legal experience. The man on her porch was somewhere in his early 30s, perhaps 32 or 33, lean in a way that suggested he spent a good portion of his time on horseback, with a face that was weathered enough to suggest He had been doing that for a while. He had brown hair that needed cutting and dark eyes that watched her walk through the gate with a kind of calm, attentive interest that was not rude but was absolutely thorough. He stood when she came through the gate. He was taller than she had expected as well, and he put his hat back on his head as he stood, which was a small gesture she noted without quite knowing why. "Miss Bancroft," he said. "Mr. Sullivan," she said. "You're a day early." "I made better time than I expected," he said, without apology but without arrogance either, just as a fact. "I hope that's not an inconvenience." "It is not," she said, coming up the porch steps past him to unlock the door. "Come in. I have coffee." That first evening, they sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours. Eliza spread her documents across the oilcloth in the order she had arranged them. The original land deed from 1859, the papers of inheritance, the promissory note in question, the payment receipts she had kept meticulously, the ledger pages showing the account balance, a letter from the bank in Wichita that corroborated her father's payment history. Robert Sullivan went through each document in order, reading carefully, making notes in a small book he kept in his breast pocket, asking questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable in their precision. "Did your father sign this note willingly?" he asked, setting the promissory document on the table between them. "Yes," she said, "and he understood the terms. My father was not an uneducated man, Mr. Sullivan. I am not suggesting he was. I am asking what your testimony will be if Greer's lawyer raises the question of whether Thomas Bancroft fully understood what he was pledging." She was quiet for a moment because she recognized the difference between being asked and being challenged. "He understood," she said. "He was not happy about needing the loan. He intended to pay it off by the end of the following year. He had a plan." "Good," Sullivan said, making a note. "And the payments, all of these receipts are in your handwriting." "I managed the books," she said. "That's fine, but I want to make sure we have at least 1 or 2 in your father's hand or a bank statement that shows the transfers. Can you get a statement from Wichita?" "I wrote to them 2 weeks ago. I have not heard back yet." He nodded. "Write again tomorrow. Tell them the hearing date. That sometimes produces a faster response." He looked at the deed again, holding it toward the lamp. "This is original." "Yes. And Greer has no claim on the deed itself. He is claiming only through the promissory note. That is my understanding." "Then his argument is that the note defaults to land upon the death of the signatory," Sullivan said, almost to himself, turning the promissory note over in his hands. "Which would require the note to contain language specifying that, or for there to be a separate agreement." He set it down. "This note does not contain that language." Eliza had noticed the same thing but had not been entirely confident in her own reading of it. "I thought the same," she said carefully. "But I was not sure if there was something in territorial law that I was not aware of." "There is not," he said. "If there were a separate agreement, Greer would have filed it with his claim. He filed only the note. Which means his entire case rests on a creative interpretation of a document that does not actually say what he says it says." She looked at him across the lamplight. "Then, why is everyone in this town acting as if I have already lost?" He met her eyes. He had a way of looking at her when she asked a direct question that suggested he would give her a direct answer, which she was beginning to understand was not as common as it should be. "Because you are a woman alone, and Harlan Greer is a powerful man, and Judge Abernathy has to live here after the hearing is over and you may not," he said. "The law says one thing, power says another. Our job is to make the law louder than the power." She picked up her coffee cup. It was cold, she had forgotten it. She set it back down. "Can you do that?" "I believe so," he said. "But I want you to understand something, Miss Bancroft. Even with everything you have here, and what you have is genuinely strong, there is no certainty. Judges have wide discretion. Abernathy may find a way to split the ruling, to award Greer partial satisfaction, something that technically follows the letter of the law while giving a powerful man enough not to feel defeated. You should prepare yourself for that possibility." "I am prepared for it," she said. "That does not mean I will accept it." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something that moved in the direction of one. "Good," he said. "Neither will I." He stayed at the boarding house in town but came out to the ranch each morning for the next 3 weeks. They worked at the kitchen table, sometimes for 6 or 7 hours at a stretch, building the case piece by piece. The bank statement from Wichita arrived after 11 days and was exactly what Eliza had said it would be: a clear, unambiguous record of regular payments that demonstrated the loan was not in default. Sullivan had it certified by the postmaster to establish its authenticity. In those 3 weeks, Eliza came to know Robert Sullivan the way you come to know someone when you are under pressure together. Not the presented version of a person, the polished exterior they offer in social situations, but the actual texture of their character. She learned that he was the son of an Irish immigrant father and an American mother who had been a schoolteacher in Missouri, and that he had gone east to study law at a time when most men his age were heading west, and that he had come west eventually anyway because he found Eastern law too comfortable, too enclosed, too tilted toward those who already had everything they needed. He did not say any of this in a speech. He said it in fragments, in the natural course of conversation over coffee and case notes, and she assembled it the way you assemble a picture from pieces. She learned that he rode a bay horse named Calhoun that he had an obvious affection for, because on the mornings when he arrived at the ranch, he would sometimes stop at the fence for a few minutes before coming inside, just running his hand along the horse's neck, and there was a gentleness in that gesture that she found unexpectedly telling. She learned that he drank his coffee without sugar and ate whatever was placed in front of him without complaint, and had strong opinions about the territorial land laws that were worth listening to even when they were not directly relevant to her case, because they reflected a mind that had thought seriously about the relationship between law and justice, and had concluded, without bitterness but without illusion, that the two were not the same thing, and that the gap between them was where most suffering occurred. She learned that he was 31 years old, that he had never been married, that he had been briefly engaged to a woman in St. Louis who had decided she did not want a life of circuit law in the territories, and that he spoke of this without rancor, simply as a fact that had sorted itself out. She learned these things because she asked. She had decided early in their working relationship that there was no useful purpose served by pretending she was not curious about him, and she was a person who asked questions when she wanted to know things, which was something he seemed to find more refreshing than intrusive. What she did not allow herself to examine too carefully in those first 2 weeks was the specific quality of her attention to him. She noticed things. She noticed the way he pushed his hair back from his forehead when he was thinking hard about something. She noticed that he had a habit of turning his pen end over end between his fingers when he was listening, which was the only thing he did that suggested he was not entirely still inside. She noticed that when he laughed, which was not often, but not infrequently either, it was a genuine, unguarded thing that changed his whole face. She noticed all of this and told herself firmly that she was simply a person who paid attention to detail, and that paying attention to the details of a man she was working closely with under stressful circumstances was entirely natural and meant nothing specific. She was not entirely convincing to herself, but she was convincing enough to keep things functional, which was what mattered. What she did not expect was for him to notice her back. Not in the way she had experienced before, the assessing, evaluating kind of noticing that men in her world tended to apply to women as though they were property to be appraised. What she noticed from Robert Sullivan was a different quality of attention, the kind that listened when she spoke about the ranch not as a woman bravely managing what a man should be managing, but as an expert in something she actually knew. He asked her questions about the cattle operation, about her breeding decisions, about the water management system her father had installed, and he listened to the answers with the same focused attention he gave to legal questions, which was to say he actually heard what she said and sometimes asked a follow-up that demonstrated he had not only heard it but thought about it. Somewhere near the end of the second week, Pete Dawes mentioned to Eliza in passing, with the careful neutral tone of a man who was conveying information without taking a position on it, that Mr. Sullivan had spent about 40 minutes that morning talking with the ranch hands about the spring calf numbers, and seemed to have a reasonable working knowledge of cattle for a lawyer. Eliza filed this information in the same drawer she had filed a number of other things about Robert Sullivan, and went back to her evening reading of case law. The night before the hearing, they sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight. The case was as prepared as it was going to be. Every document was in order. Every argument had been rehearsed. Sullivan had spent considerable time that week speaking with several people in town who were willing to testify as to Thomas Bancroft's character, his reliability, his payment habits, the esteem in which he had been held. He had also, through careful inquiry, determined that Harlan Greer had attempted a similar maneuver 2 years previously with a smaller homestead to the west, and while that case had never gone to hearing, the widow involved had simply left, which was what Greer had been counting on. 2 people who had witnessed the events were willing to speak to what they had seen. Greer's lawyer was a man from Wichita named Colton Marsh, and he was good. Sullivan had encountered him in one previous matter and respected his ability while finding his ethics somewhat elastic. They both knew this was going to be close. "Is there anything else?" Eliza asked, looking at the neatly organized stack of documents before them. "Nothing legal," Sullivan said. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression that was different from anything she had seen from him across this table in the past 3 weeks. Different in a way she could identify, but was not quite sure what to do with. He seemed to become aware of her awareness simultaneously because he looked down at his pen and then set it carefully on the table, and when he looked up again the expression had been carefully moderated, though not entirely erased. "Get some sleep," he said. "You need to walk into that courthouse tomorrow with nothing on your face but confidence." "I am always confident," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean the kind that comes from rest, not the kind that comes from stubbornness." She almost smiled at that. "Those are the same thing in my case." He did smile briefly, fully. "I know that too," he said, and stood, and put on his coat, and said good night, and walked out into the dark to where Calhoun was tied at the post. She stayed at the table for a moment after he was gone, looking at the stack of documents that represented her father's life's work and her own, and then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. The courthouse in Caldwell was the second largest building in town after the church, a solid frame building on the main street that served as courthouse, meeting hall, and occasional theater depending on the season. On the morning of April 3rd, it was more full than Eliza had anticipated. Word had traveled about the hearing, as word always traveled in small western towns, carried on every errand and transaction and casual conversation, and people had opinions. Some of them had come because they were genuinely interested in the outcome. Some had come because Harlan Greer's expansion of his holdings was something they had been watching with private anxiety for years, wondering when he might turn his attention to their property. Some had come simply because it was a better entertainment than anything else available on a Thursday morning in Caldwell, Kansas. Eliza walked in through the front door with Robert Sullivan on her left side and Pete Dawes on her right, and she walked the way she had walked onto that porch in the muddy boots and the horse-smelling coat straight-backed, clear-eyed, taking the room for granted. She was wearing her best dress, a deep blue wool that her mother had made years ago, and that still fit her well, and she had her hair up in a style that Margaret Hughes had helped her arrange that morning, which was more formal than her usual practical braid. She heard the room shift a little as she came in, the way rooms shift when something they have been waiting for arrives. Harlan Greer was already seated at his table with Colton Marsh. He looked at Eliza as she came in with an expression that was meant to be genial but contained, underneath the geniality, something that was not. His two sons were in the gallery. Several members of the town council were present. Judge Abernathy entered precisely at 9 o'clock, arranged himself behind the bench with the particular self-important fussiness of a man who understood that the bench conferred authority and was careful to use every element of it. The hearing lasted 3.5 hours. Colton Marsh was, as Sullivan had predicted, good. He argued with polish and assurance, painting a picture of a solemn financial obligation that Thomas Bancroft had entered into freely, and that justice required be honored. He leaned heavily on the sentiment of a debt unpaid, which was a powerful argument in a culture that took financial obligations seriously. He questioned the bank statement's reliability, suggested that the payment receipts in Eliza's handwriting were potentially self-serving, and implied, without quite stating it directly, that a young woman managing her father's books might not have the same command of the full financial picture that her father himself would have had. Robert Sullivan objected to that last implication twice. He was sustained once and overruled once. He did not allow either outcome to alter his composure or the pace of his argument. When it was his turn, Sullivan proceeded with a precision that Eliza found almost hypnotic to watch from her chair at the table beside him. He was not showy. He did not perform outrage or make theatrical gestures. He simply laid the truth on the table like a card player showing a winning hand. This is the document. These are the words. This is what they say. This is what they do not say. He walked Judge Abernathy through the promissory note with the patience of a teacher who was sure of the material and not in any hurry, pointing to each clause, demonstrating clearly that the note contained no language that converted the pledge to a forfeiture upon the pledger's death. The plaintiff's entire claim rests on a right that this document does not confer, Sullivan said, and his voice was clear and level and filled the room. Mr. Greer is asking this court to read into a legal document a meaning that is not present in its language, because the meaning that is present does not support his position. This court must decline that invitation. He presented the witnesses. The first, an older banker named Hoffman who had driven up from Wichita specifically for this hearing, confirmed the payment history with the calm authority of a man who dealt in numbers and had no stake in the narrative. The second witness, a woman named Clara Totham who had watched Greer pursue her neighbor's property after her neighbor's husband died, spoke quietly and clearly about what she had seen. Greer's lawyer objected. Sullivan argued the relevance. Abernathy looked profoundly uncomfortable and allowed the testimony. Greer himself testified, smooth and confident, the practiced ease of a man accustomed to rooms accommodating themselves to him. He said that he had always liked Thomas Bancroft, that this was purely a business matter, that the loan had been for a considerable sum, and he had extended every reasonable patience. Sullivan cross-examined him. The questions were not aggressive, but they were surgical. Where exactly does the note say what you claim it says? Which clause? Which line? Sullivan let Greer's own lawyer's document speak against him, question by methodical question, until Greer's confident demeanor developed a faint but visible crack. Eliza testified last. She sat in the chair beside the judge's bench and answered every question in a clear, steady voice, looking at whoever was speaking to her directly, not at the gallery, not at Greer, not at Sullivan except when he was the one asking. She knew her documents better than anyone in the room, including the lawyers. When Colton Marsh suggested, with careful politeness, that her emotional investment in the property might be clouding her interpretation of the financial realities, she looked at him for a moment before answering. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "I understand the emotional investment you are referring to. This land is where my parents built their life and where my father is buried and where I have worked for the last 8 years. I would not pretend that does not matter to me. But the receipts do not reflect my emotions. The bank statement does not reflect my emotions. The ledger pages do not reflect my emotions. The text of the promissory note does not reflect my emotions. Every piece of documentation before this court reflects facts, and the facts support my position. My emotional investment in the outcome does not change what the documents say." There was a small sound from the gallery, not quite applause, more like a collective exhale. Judge Abernathy deliberated for 40 minutes in his chambers while the courtroom sat in a charged and uncomfortable quiet. Eliza sat at the table. She did not look around the room. She kept her hands flat on the table in front of her and her expression calm. Sullivan sat beside her and was similarly still. At one point, his hand moved half an inch on the table, not quite toward hers but in that direction, and then stopped, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of everything about him by that point, which was to say in an involuntary and unavoidable way. When Abernathy returned, he looked like a man who had spent the last 40 minutes doing something he found moderately unpleasant. He arranged his papers. He cleared his throat. He delivered his ruling in the careful, qualified language that judges use when they are delivering a verdict they feel somewhat forced into, and the verdict was this. The promissory note did not, under its plain language, constitute a forfeiture clause, and the payment records presented by the defense demonstrated clearly that the debt was not in default at the time of Thomas Bancroft's death. The claim filed by Harlan Greer was dismissed. The Bancroft land deed remained in full force. Eliza sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. The room around her was louder than it had been before, a low roar of voices, not celebratory exactly, more the sound of a room releasing something it had been holding. Greer's face had gone the particular shade of controlled anger that powerful men wear when they lose in public and know they have to manage their response carefully. His lawyer was already leaning toward him in conference. Then Sullivan turned to her, and there was nothing professionally managed in his expression at that moment. It was simply glad. Open in a way she had not seen from him before, and she found herself looking at it with a kind of hunger that surprised her. "You did that," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. "That was your work, Miss Bancroft. Every document, every receipt, every year you kept those books, that is what won this." "We did it together," she said. "We presented it," he said, "but you built it." Pete Dawes was at her shoulder then, gripping her arm with his weathered hand, and saying something about knowing it would go this way. And Margaret Hughes was there from the gallery, and several other people she knew from town who pressed forward to offer congratulations, and Eliza let herself be in the middle of it for a few minutes and did not try to contain the feeling entirely. Later, when the room had thinned out and the afternoon light was coming through the courthouse windows at a long angle, she found Sullivan alone near the door, putting papers back into his satchel with the systematic efficiency she had come to recognize as his way of closing things out. She stood beside him and he looked up. "What do you do now?" she asked. "There is a case in Dodge City I should go and see about," he said. "I told them I would be there by mid-April." She nodded. "How long will you be there?" "I don't know, a few weeks, maybe longer." He buckled the satchel. "Depends on the case." "And after that," he looked at her. There was a pause that carried more than silence usually carries. "I don't always know after that," he said. "It tends to depend on where I am needed." She held his gaze. She was a woman who had learned to say what she meant, because the time for anything else was a luxury she had not often had. "And is there anything that might influence where you choose to go after Dodge City?" He was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light caught the side of his face and the patient honesty in his eyes. "Yes," he said simply. "There is." She breathed in. "Well," she said, "the Bancroft Ranch is exactly where it has always been." He almost smiled. And then he did smile fully, and it was the kind of smile that rearranged the light a little. "I know where it is," he said. He left for Dodge City 3 days later. They shook hands at the train station, which was an entirely inadequate gesture for what had passed between them, but it was what the moment allowed, and she was not the kind of person to manufacture a sentiment publicly. He kept her hand a moment longer than a handshake required. She let him. She rode back to the ranch in the April morning with Pete Dawes beside her and the wide Kansas sky above her, and the land her land, secured, legal, documented, indisputably hers, spread out on both sides of the road, and she thought about the particular way Robert Sullivan had said, "I know where it is," and something warm took up residence in her chest and did not leave. The weeks that followed were the normal, demanding, absorbing rhythm of spring ranch work, branding and marking the new calves, moving the herd to better grazing as the grass came in, repairing the fence line on the north quarter where winter had done some damage. Eliza worked alongside her hands as she always had, not from any effort to prove herself, but because she found the physical work clarifying, and because a ranch ran better when the person in charge of it understood every part of it from the inside. She received a letter from Robert Sullivan 11 days after he left. It was not long, 2 pages, written in that precise slanted hand she had come to recognize. He described the Dodge City case, which involved a water rights dispute between 2 cattle operations, and was apparently complicated by the fact that one of the parties was also involved in a pending criminal matter, which created jurisdictional tangles that he was clearly finding interesting if frustrating. He described the town in a handful of sentences that were dry and accurate, and contained a kind of wry affection for the West's particular brand of chaos that she recognized, because she felt it too. At the end, in a paragraph that had a slightly different quality from the professional report that had preceded it, he said that he hoped the spring calving was going well, and that the Bancroft land was peaceful now that the legal question had been settled, and that he found himself thinking about Kansas more than was perhaps strictly professional. She read that last paragraph twice. Then she sat down and wrote back a letter that was 6 pages long, which surprised her somewhat, though not as much as the ease with which the pages had filled. She wrote about the calves and the fence and the condition of the grass. She wrote about a particular evening where the sunset had been so dramatic that even Pete Dawes, who was not a man given to aesthetic commentary, had stopped what he was doing and stood looking at it for a full minute. She wrote about a conversation she'd had with Margaret Hughes about the town's plans for a new schoolhouse, and her own thoughts about education in the territory, and what it meant to build something that lasted. At the end, she said that she thought Kansas might be worth more than strictly professional consideration, if a person were inclined to invest in it. She sealed the letter with a feeling she had not felt in some years, which was the particular anticipation of someone who has sent a message and is genuinely curious about the reply. His reply came in 9 days, 9 pages. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee, and a smile she was glad no one else was present to see. He returned to Caldwell on the last Saturday of May, arriving in the late afternoon when the light was golden and horizontal across the prairie. He rode Calhoun off the livery wagon at the station, and she was there this time, having arranged to be, because she had his letter in her pocket that said he was expected on the Saturday afternoon train, and she had decided that she was not going to pretend she was not watching for him. He saw her when he came through the station gate. He stopped walking for a moment, which she found satisfying, and then he came toward her with the steady, deliberate stride of a man who knows where he is going and has given up pretending otherwise. "Miss Bancroft," he said. "Mr. Sullivan," she said. "How is Dodge City?" "Still standing, unfortunately for some." "Did you win your case?" "We did." "The water rights are settled and the criminal matter is someone else's problem now." He paused. He was looking at her in the direct, thorough way she remembered. "You look well." "I am well," she said. "The ranch is well. The spring calving came in better than we expected. I'm glad to hear it. Are you staying in town tonight?" "I had thought to, yes. And then, if the offer extends, I was hoping to come out to the ranch tomorrow. There is something I wanted to discuss with you." "There is something I wanted to discuss with you as well," she said. "Is there?" "Yes," he smiled. "Then we are in agreement about that much at least." She rode back to the ranch that evening and had the best night's sleep she'd had in weeks. Not because anything had been resolved, nothing had, but because of the specific quality of possibility that had been in the air between them at the station, tangible as the smell of the prairie. He came to the ranch the next morning, Sunday, when the day was easy and the work was light. She had given the hands their Sunday freedom, and the ranch was quiet in the way that ranches are quiet in the middle of good weather. The animals content, the building solid, the whole enterprise briefly at rest. She made breakfast, which was something they had not done before, because their previous time together had always had the quality of professional urgency. This morning was different. She made eggs and salt pork and biscuits, and they sat at the kitchen table without a single document between them, and it was strange and entirely natural at the same time. "You wanted to discuss something," she said after a while. He set down his coffee. He looked at her across the table in the morning light with the same honest directness he brought to everything. "I did," he said. "I am going to tell you what I am thinking because I believe that is how you prefer things to be communicated, and I believe I have come to know you well enough to be right about that." "You are right about that," she said. "I would like to come back to Caldwell," he said. "Not on another case, or not only that. I would like to set up here at least for a time. There is enough legal work in this county to keep me occupied, and I find that the county has developed certain other attractions that make it difficult to imagine being very far from it for very long." She looked at him steadily. "Certain other attractions." "One in particular," he said, and he said it without flourish, simply, in the way he said things that were true. The morning was very quiet around them. A horse shifted in the pasture outside. The spring air came through the kitchen window carrying the smell of grass and earth. Eliza Bancroft had been managing, defending, and building this land for most of her adult life, and she had made every significant decision on it with clear eyes and a clear head, and this was not going to be any different. "I think you should do that," she said. "You do. I do. I think you should set up in Caldwell, and I think we should spend some time getting to know each other under circumstances that are not entirely defined by legal crisis." "Those would be better circumstances," he agreed. "I also think," she said carefully, "that I have a general idea of where this is going, and I am not opposed to the direction." Something in his face changed in a way she had come to wait for without admitting she was waiting for it, the full, unguarded openness of it when he was genuinely moved. "Neither am I," he said. "Good," she said. "More coffee." He laughed at that, a full, bright sound in the quiet kitchen, and she smiled, and refilled his cup, and the morning settled around them like something that had been waiting to arrive. Robert Sullivan set up a law office in Caldwell in June of 1874, in a room above the general store that Margaret Hughes rented him at a reasonable rate, with the specific private satisfaction of a woman who felt she had had a hand in the situation. He built a practice there with the same efficient thoroughness he applied to everything, and within a few months had become the attorney that people in Caldwell and the surrounding county turned to when they needed someone who would work hard and tell them the truth. He had a reputation for taking on cases where the law favored the powerful over the righteous, not from any idealistic innocence about how the world worked, but from a principled refusal to accept it. He and Eliza spent that summer in the gradual, delightful process of coming to know each other under the better circumstances she had specified. He rode out to the ranch most evenings when his work allowed it. She came into town on supply days and on the occasions when she had banking or other business, and they had supper at the boarding house dining room or at Margaret Hughes' table, because Margaret had developed a proprietary interest in their courtship that they both found more charming than they expected. What happened that summer, in the course of 100 ordinary conversations, and shared meals and evenings on the porch watching the prairie go dark, was something that Eliza had not allowed herself to fully anticipate because she had learned that anticipating things too specifically was a good way to be disappointed by them. What happened was love. Real, specific, particular love, not the generalized romantic feeling that arrived attached to any attractive stranger, but the kind that grew out of knowing someone's actual mind and actual character, from having seen them work and think and make decisions under pressure, from knowing what they found funny and what they found intolerable, and how they treated people who could do nothing for them. In July, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house watching a storm come in from the west, she said, "I was certain you were going to be 50 years old when you arrived in March." He turned his head to look at her. 50. I had built up a mental portrait, she said. Silver-haired, authoritative, possibly with a pocket watch. I have a pocket watch. You do, but you do not look like my mental portrait. Is that a complaint? No, she said. It is an observation. She looked at the sky where the clouds were building in dramatic formations that would have put a theatrical company to shame. I am very glad you are not 50. So am I, he said dryly, and she smiled. He reached over and took her hand, which he had done before, but there was something slightly different about it that evening, a deliberateness that made her look at him. He was looking at the sky, but the hand around hers was not a casual gesture, and she waited. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "All right. But I want to be clear first about something." He turned to look at her then. "Your land is yours. Your ranch is yours. Your decisions about both are yours. Whatever I am asking has nothing to do with any of that, and if the answer is no, then none of that changes. I am absolutely clear on this." She felt something move in her chest that was partly the gathering force of the coming storm and partly something that had nothing to do with weather. "You are being very thorough about the preamble," she said. "I am a lawyer," he said. "I believe in stating terms clearly." "Then state them." He held her hand. The wind was picking up across the prairie, running through the long grass in waves, carrying the smell of rain. "I love you, Eliza," he said. "I have loved you since probably the second or third evening at this table, which I did not immediately admit to myself because I was supposed to be building your legal case and loving you seemed professionally complicated. But there it is, and I would like, very much, if you would marry me. On the condition, which is not a condition, it is a certainty, that your land and your ranch and your authority over both remain exactly as they are. I am not asking for a partnership in your property. I am asking for a partnership in your life." She sat with that for a moment, the wind moving around them, the first low rumble of the coming thunder distant and soft. "That is the most lawyerly marriage proposal I have ever heard," she said. "It is the only marriage proposal I have ever made," he said. "I know." She turned to face him fully. "I love you too, Robert. I have been aware of that for longer than I intended. And yes, the answer is yes." He kissed her then, in the warm wind with the storm coming and the land spreading out around them in every direction. And it was the kind of kiss that a person remembers with complete clarity for the rest of their life. Not because it was dramatic, though it was, but because it was entirely honest. They were married in September of 1874, in the church in Caldwell, on a day that was warm and golden and perfect in the particular way that Kansas September days sometimes are, as though the season is offering its best work before the cold arrives. Margaret Hughes cried in the first pew. Pete Dawes stood up for the couple alongside a friend of Sullivan's from his legal circuit days, who had ridden down from Abilene for the occasion. Judge Abernathy, who had the self-awareness and social grace to understand that his presence at this celebration was perhaps a little ironic given that he had been widely expected to rule against Eliza 6 months earlier, sent a very handsome set of kitchen dishes instead. Harlan Greer did not attend and sent nothing, which surprised no one and disappointed no one. Eliza did not change her name on any of the land documents. Sullivan had made sure, before the ceremony, that all of the relevant paperwork was absolutely clear on that point. The Bancroft deed remained the Bancroft deed. This caused a certain amount of conversation in town, mostly from men who found the arrangement unusual, and Eliza's response to all such conversations was a pleasant expression and a complete refusal to justify herself that effectively ended each conversation very quickly. Their first year of marriage was, in the way of first years, a process of learning to share a life that had been organized entirely around one person for a long time. They were both strong-willed and accustomed to independence, and there were adjustments. There were evenings when two people who both knew exactly what they thought about something had to find a way to arrive at a decision that respected both positions, and those evenings were sometimes challenging. But neither of them gave up easily, and neither of them was interested in winning at the other's expense, and they had the fundamental advantage of actually liking each other, which is a thing that is underestimated in its importance to the functioning of a marriage. Sullivan's law practice grew steadily through that first year. He took on a case in October that became something of a landmark in the county, a dispute over a filed homestead claim involving a settler family who had been driven off their property by a larger operation using what amounted to organized intimidation. It was not the most legally sophisticated case Sullivan had ever argued, but it mattered enormously, and he won it, and it established him firmly as someone who would not be influenced by the power dynamics of the county in the way that people had hoped he might be. Harlan Greer remained in the county. He did not attempt any further action against the Bancroft land. He had, by that point, understood that the combination of clear documentation and a determined lawyer meant that avenue was closed. He continued his expansion in other directions and continued to be someone that people were careful around. But he was slightly diminished in the county's understanding of him, because he had tried to take a young woman's land through legal gamesmanship, and a sharp-eyed lawyer from Missouri had stopped him, and some things once seen cannot be unseen. In the spring of 1875, Eliza found out she was expecting a child. She told Robert on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight where they had first built her legal case together, which felt like the right place to tell him. His response was everything she had expected from a man she knew well: quiet, full, genuine, and then immediately practical in the way that genuine emotion sometimes manifests, as the sudden desire to make sure everything is arranged and prepared and safe. "Are you well?" was his first question. "I am completely well," she said. "Should we get a doctor? Dr. Hennessy comes through Caldwell regularly, but—" "Robert," she said, "I am well. Women have been managing this considerably longer than there have been circuit doctors." "I know that," he said. "I would still like— We will speak with Mrs. Calloway, who has delivered half the babies in this county and knows what she is doing," Eliza said. "And Dr. Hennessy will be informed. And you will resist the impulse to manage this the way you manage a case, because it is not a case." He was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression that she found completely disarming in its undefended tenderness. "I love you very much," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I love you too. Now let's talk about the pasture rotation, because I want to have the East Quarter cleared before the summer comes in, and I need to think about whether we have enough hands for that." He laughed, and she smiled, and the lamp burned between them, and the ranch was around them, solid and real, and hers and theirs. Their son was born in November of 1875, on a cold, clear night when the stars were very bright over the Kansas prairie. They named him Thomas James Sullivan, Thomas for Eliza's father and James for Robert's, and from the first, he was a child who appeared to have arrived with considerable opinions about the world and intentions to express them freely, which neither of his parents found surprising. Little Thomas, or Tom, as he quickly became, because he had a personality that was too large for a diminutive name, grew in the way of ranch children, with the outdoors for a classroom and animals for daily companions and two adults around him who took both ideas and feelings seriously. Eliza taught him to ride when he was 4, insisting on doing this herself, starting him on a gentle old mare named Daisy, and progressing with the methodical patience she applied to everything worth doing well. Robert read to him every evening, fiction and history, and when Tom began to show interest, law, simplified but not condescended to, because both his parents believed that children were capable of understanding more than adults usually credit them with. The ranch grew through those years as the cattle market expanded. Eliza made a decision in the spring of 1876 to begin moving the herd toward a higher quality breeding program, focusing on producing beef cattle that would command better prices at the Wichita market rather than competing purely on volume with the larger operations. This was a 5-year plan that required patience and capital, and it was the right decision, as the market over the following years proved. Sullivan's law practice in Caldwell became, over time, one of the most respected in the region. He was known for being thorough, honest, and difficult to discourage, and for having a particular expertise in property and water rights disputes that was increasingly valuable as the territory filled in and the competition over land and water intensified. He was asked more than once in those years whether he would consider a position in Topeka, either in a private firm or in some governmental capacity. He thanked the people who asked and declined. In the winter of 1877, on an evening when the wind was significant outside and the kitchen was warm and Tom was asleep, Eliza told him she was expecting again. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, in what was becoming a tradition of important conversations at that table, and his response this time was still the same first question, "Are you well?" but delivered with a slightly greater ease, because he had learned in the 2 years since Tom's birth that Eliza was constitutionally accurate about her own condition and that she would tell him truthfully if something was wrong. "Completely well," she said. "Good," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand, and the lamp was warm between them. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose Sullivan, Clara for the witness who had spoken up in court for Eliza's father's character, Rose for a small private reason of Eliza's own, arrived in July of 1878, in the full heat of summer, with far less drama than her brother's November entrance, and with a disposition in those first months that seemed notably more serene. Though Eliza pointed out to Robert that it was perhaps early to draw conclusions about character from infant behavior. Tom was 3 when Clara was born, and he received the information that he had a sister with the gravity of a small person who had been given a responsibility, which was more or less how Eliza had presented it to him. He spent the first year of Clara's life performing the duties of an older brother with variable success and unvarying enthusiasm. That same summer of 1878 brought a development that neither Eliza nor Robert had anticipated. Harlan Greer decided to sell his holdings in Caldwell County and move to Colorado. The circumstances were complex, several legal challenges to his land acquisitions over the years, a downturn in his particular cattle operations profitability, possibly other factors that Eliza did not know and did not pursue knowing. The news came through Margaret Hughes on a warm July morning when Eliza was in town for supplies, and Clara was 3 weeks old, and Tom was at home with Pete Dawes learning about fence posts. "He is selling everything," Margaret said, with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has been watching a particular narrative for 4 years and finds the ending appropriate. "His main property, all of it, moving to Denver." Eliza stood at the counter with Clara in her arms, looking at Margaret, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but a combination of the two with some additional quality she did not have a name for. The particular feeling of a chapter that has been closed. "I hope Denver suits him," she said, and meant it to be neither generous nor bitter, simply accurate. She told Robert that evening on the porch while Clara slept in her arms and the summer dusk came in over the long grass and Tom ran circles in the yard with the enthusiasm of a 3-year-old who has not yet encountered anything he could not do for long enough. "Greer is leaving," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I heard," he said, "from Prescott this afternoon." "How do you feel about it?" he considered. "Relieved," he said, Not because I was worried he would try anything else I was not or not seriously, but because his presence here was always a reminder of what might have happened and his absence will not be. He looked at her. How do you feel about it? The same, she said, and something else. What else? She looked out at the land, at Tom running in the yard, at the summer evening coming over it all in the particular golden way that summer evenings came over the Kansas prairie when the conditions were right. Like the land is just ours now, she said, without any shadow on it. He put his arm around her shoulders gently, mindful of Clara sleeping. She leaned into it. It was always yours, he said. It just took a while for everyone else to recognize it. Our lawyer helped with that part, she said. Your lawyer was compensated fairly, he said, with the dry precision that she had loved since the first weeks. He was, she agreed, and I believe he found the terms acceptable. Exceedingly acceptable, he said, and she laughed softly in the summer evening, and Clara stirred a little in her arms and then settled, and Tom came running across the yard to show her a bug he had found in the grass, and the ranch was around them, solid and permanent and entirely, indisputably theirs. The years that followed had the quality of the good years, not without difficulty, because no years are without difficulty, but structured around a foundation that was sound and a love that had been tested early and come through solid. The cattle operation expanded to include a small horse breeding program in 1880 that Eliza had been wanting to establish for several years, focusing on working horses for ranch use that were bred for both strength and temperament. This became, over time, almost as profitable as the cattle side and considerably more enjoyable, because Eliza had always had a particular affinity for horses that went beyond utility. Sullivan took on a young associate in 1881, a recent law graduate named Harris, who he trained in the same direct, demanding, honest manner he applied to everything, and who turned out to be excellent, which allowed the practice to take on more cases than one man could handle alone. He also became, in those years, increasingly active in the county's civic affairs, not from any ambition for political office, which he genuinely did not want, but from the belief that law worked best when the community it served was engaged in shaping its own standards. He helped establish a county bar association, wrote articles for the Territorial Legal Journal about property rights and homestead law, and testified twice before committees in Topeka on matters relating to territorial development. Tom, at 7 years old, was a child who read everything he could reach, asked questions with an energy that sometimes exhausted even his well-equipped parents, had an absolute lack of fear around large animals that occasionally terrified Eliza, despite her general confidence in her son's judgment, and showed early signs of either becoming a lawyer like his father or a cattle rancher like his mother, and everyone around him speculated that he would probably try to be both. Clara, at 4, was a person of decided opinions, extraordinary focus, and an interest in horses that her mother found both familiar and deeply pleasing. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and a way of looking at the world with a combination of patience and intensity that suggested she was taking very careful notes. In the late summer of 1882, Robert Sullivan sat down at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, their kitchen table, the table where they had built a legal case, and told each other the truth about 100 different things, and decided the shape of their life together. And Eliza brought coffee, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight the way they had on the first evening of their acquaintance. He reached into his breast pocket and placed a document on the table between them. She looked at it. "What is this?" "A deed amendment," he said, formally adding the Sullivan name alongside the Bancroft name on the property title. "The Bancroft deed remains the foundation document. Nothing changes in terms of your legal ownership. But I thought," he paused, "I thought it might be the thing to do, to formalize what has been true for 8 years. She looked at the document. It was his handwriting, precise and slightly slanted, filling in the official form with the care he brought to everything he wrote. She looked at it for a long time. "You did not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was the same kind of lamp they had used on all those evenings 8 years ago, a thing of glass and oil and steady light, and his face in it was familiar to her in every particular, every line and expression and quality of attention, and she loved him with the specific, informed, accumulated love that only comes from years of genuine knowing. Bancroft and Sullivan, she read from the document. "In that order," he said. She smiled. He smiled back. She picked up the pen and signed her name. They sat there a while longer after that, drinking coffee and talking about the things that people who have built a life together talk about in the evenings: Tom's reading, Clara's progress with horses, the water situation in the South Pasture, Harris's development in the practice, a letter Eliza had received from a woman in the next county who was facing a land dispute and wanted to know if there was a good lawyer in Caldwell who would take her case honestly. "There is," Eliza said, when she mentioned this. "Tell her to come in," Robert said. She nodded and wrote the reply the following morning in the clear, direct style she always used, saying that there was indeed a good lawyer in Caldwell who took cases honestly and worked hard and believed the law should serve people rather than the powerful, and that the woman was welcome to come and make her case. The ranch in the autumn of 1882 was a different thing from the ranch of 1874, not in its essential nature, the land, the grass, the wind, the sky, but in its scope and stability. The main house had been expanded twice, carefully, in a way that maintained its original character while accommodating the larger family and the occasional guest. The bunkhouse had been rebuilt after a fire in 1879, better than it was before. There was a proper barn now and a good corral system for the horses, and a kitchen garden that Eliza had established in her second year of marriage that had grown from a practical necessity into something that gave her a specific daily pleasure. Pete Dawes was still there, though he had let a younger foreman named Avery take over most of the daily management. He lived in a small house on the east end of the property that Eliza had insisted on building for him when he mentioned, once, that he thought he might retire somewhere. She had told him that this was somewhere, and that was settled. He spent his days now doing whatever work he chose and reading newspapers and playing checkers with Tom on Sunday afternoons, and seemed entirely satisfied with the arrangement. It was Pete who, on a warm October evening in that autumn of 1882, came up to the porch where Eliza was sitting with the ranch accounts and sat down in the other chair with the particular weight of a man who had something on his mind. "Good evening, Pete," she said, not looking up from her ledger. "Evening," he said. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man organizing his thoughts. "You know, when your father took me on in '62, this operation was nothing. 40 head and hope." She looked up then. "I know. You've done something with it," he said. "Both of you." She was quiet for a moment because there was something in his voice that was beyond an ordinary observation. "Are you feeling all right, Pete?" "Fine," he said. "Better than fine. Just," he looked out at the land, at the long Kansas evening coming down over the grass. "I watched a lot of people lose what your father built. The weather takes it, or the market takes it, or some man with more money and fewer principles takes it. I watched you almost lose it. And I watched you not lose it. And I want you to know I think," he stopped. He was not a man who found sentiment easy. "I think your father would be very satisfied with what he sees." Eliza set down her pen. She looked at Pete Dawes, this quiet, capable, loyal man who had been part of the land as long as she could remember, and felt something in her throat. "Thank you, Pete," she said. He nodded, with the dignity of a man who has said what needed saying and considers the matter complete, and they sat on the porch together in the October evening, and the land spread out before them in the last of the light, and it was everything her father had built and everything she had fought for, and everything she and Robert Sullivan had grown from there, solid and present and real. Robert came up the path from the direction of the barn where he had been consulting with Avery about the horse preparation for the upcoming trip to Wichita, and he saw them on the porch and came up the steps and dropped into a chair and said, "The light is extraordinary tonight." "It is," Eliza agreed. Pete stood, with the deliberate movement of a man whose joints had opinions about the October cold, and said good evening and went back toward his house. Robert watched him go, and then looked at Eliza with the question in his eyes that he did not need to ask because she shook her head slightly and smiled. And he understood, because after 8 years of marriage, they had developed the efficient communication system of people who have been paying close attention to each other for a long time. He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had almost reached for at the courthouse table 8 years ago and had then thought better of, and held it in the cooling evening. "Good day," he asked. "Very good day," she said. "You, very good." Tom came out through the front door then, at 7 years old, with a book in one hand and a preoccupied expression that suggested he had come outside primarily because he could read just as well out here, and the evening was interesting. He settled himself on the porch steps without addressing either parent directly, which was his current preferred mode of social interaction, and opened his book. Clara appeared in the doorway a moment later, surveying the scene with the focused assessment of a 4-year-old, who is determining whether the outdoors contains anything of interest. She decided it did, came out, and sat next to her father, leaning against his arm with the unceremonious comfort of a small child who has no doubts about her welcome. The 4 of them were on the porch as the evening came fully down and the first stars appeared, and the land was around them in every direction. The land that Eliza Bancroft had fought for in a courthouse in April of 1874, with a wet deed, and a lawyer she had not yet met, and a stubbornness that the territory had not known quite what to do with. The land that was hers, and that she had always known was hers. The land that now had 2 names on its deed, and the sound of children, and the particular quality of permanence that comes from something fought for, and won, and then tended with love for the years that follow. Eliza looked out at the prairie in the last light and felt the weight of Robert's hand around hers, and the familiar presence of her children and the solid certainty of the ground beneath the porch. And she felt, not for the first time but perhaps more fully than ever before, that she had gotten exactly what she had fought for, which was not only the land, though the land mattered deeply, but the right to stand on it on her own terms, to make her own decisions, to love the person she had chosen, to build the life she had determined to build, without anyone's permission except the law's, and the law, on a certain April day in 1874, had finally gotten it right. She had said the land was hers. She had been correct, and the rest, the man beside her, the children on the steps, the years of good work and honest love and hard seasons turned to good ones, the rest had followed, as good things follow when they are allowed to. The October stars came out over the Kansas prairie one by one, and the family on the porch sat in the light of them, and the land was still and whole and home.